So welcome back, everyone. Let's move on with our next speaker, the second speaker. So our second speaker is Dr. Heather Kirk-Ballard, who is a assistant professor and extension specialist in sustainable urban landscapes within the Department of Horticulture and College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. In her role, Dr. Ballard is developing irrigation and extension programming that emphasizes environmentally friendly landscaping practices with a strong focus on climate resilience. Her work promotes biodiversity in urban landscapes, encourages the use of native plants, and advocates for the use of permeable materials in hardscaping and water conservation techniques. Additionally, she supports efforts to reduce stormwater pollution, chemical use, and food waste. Dr. Ballard.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Let me share my PowerPoint with me. Y'all ready for me to take over? I'm sorry, I'm showing my screen share. Where is my PowerPoint? Forgive me, all. Just one second. Here we go.
No, take your time. It likes to change things around on us, especially when when I'm stopping one on my end and you're starting one on your end.
All right. Let's show in. How does that look?
You can see it.
I think it looks perfect.
Great. All right. Thanks for that introduction. And Matt, it's very good to put a face with a name, because when I was at LSU, I was part of a grant, and now I'm here at UGA. So I'm excited to be here, and thanks for having me today. We're going to talk a little bit about bringing edible landscape or utilizing edibles in landscape design. So to get started, just an introduction to edible landscaping is just what it is. It's the integration of food-producing plants like fruits, vegetables, herbs, and that includes edible flowers into ornamental landscapes, and it blends that beauty along with functionality and sustainability. So food can be grown in any garden, and by interplanting edibles with your ornamentals, you can create beautiful gardens like the one that you see here. Just a definition of edible landscaping: it's the use of food plants as a design feature in a landscape. These plants are used both for their aesthetic value as well as for their consumption. And it combines both form and function. So we're killing two birds with one stone. An important note is that edible landscapes encompass a variety of garden types and scales. They can be very small or they can be very large, but they do not include food items that are produced for sale. It's usually for your community consumption, your family's consumption, or your own consumption. So what's great about it is that it combines both form and function. We have that aesthetic along with that sustainable. A traditional landscape may look something like this. It'll incorporate hardscapes, the use of large rocks like you see here, typically ornamentals. There may be some function to that landscape. That could include shading, things like that, from large trees to help reduce energy cost and things like that. But mainly, we look at our traditional landscape as something that's aesthetically pleasing. It adds value to our home. In fact, the return on investment when it comes to landscaping is like 110%. So it's can add that aesthetic beauty, but by incorporating edibles into our landscape, we can add more color, as you can see here, as well as a source of food that we can utilize. Edible landscapes versus traditional landscapes, some of the pros are that it can be very good for the environment in that we have decreased food miles. Maybe you're not having to go to the grocery store or to go off site in order to get your food. You can actually harvest your own. It's reduced resilience on that fossil fuel supported calories that we have to go to the store for. We can just go out to our own landscapes and harvest. Health, food security. It can be horticultural therapy. We know that gardening is good for both our mental and our mental health and our physical well-being. It could be healthy food choices because we know that many vegetables and fruits are nutrient dense. And on top of that, when we grow our own food, we can actually guarantee that we know how it was produced, what chemicals were utilized, what chemicals were not utilized, what have you. So having that information, knowing that you've grown your own food. So in general, edible landscaping promotes sustainable gardening practices that can maximize water efficiency. It can also support wildlife, although when we're growing edibles, we oftentimes want to keep that wildlife out of there and keep it for ourselves. But if you don't mind sharing the bounty, and then reduce the use of chemicals in the landscape by utilizing edible crops into your landscape. All right, here's some of the cons. It can increase the amount of time that you have to spend in the landscape because of maintenance requirements, seasonal plantings, and we'll talk more in depth about cool versus warm season crops, and regular garden planning, changing those things out. Inputs, there are oftentimes increased water needs when we're producing fruits and vegetables. And in some cases, many cases actually, there's an increased need for fertilizer and nutrients for those plants because they are being more productive. Practices, increased plant waste can happen, but with composting, we can utilize that green waste. So the history of edible landscaping, people have been integrating food growing with other landscape uses, whether it be recreational or aesthetically. It's not a new concept. This has gone on for some time. We know about kitchen gardens, right? So edible landscaping, there may be parterres that are gorgeous, can be formal, laid out like this one that you see here. I see a lot of lavender. They've got a lot of herbs. You can incorporate large planters in order to put citrus trees or things that may have cold restrictions. But this has been around for a while, and it's very beautiful when we're talking about these different kitchen gardens. I love the formality of some of these, but that doesn't mean that this has to be formal. There's a diverse and complex plant systems that you can utilize. You can either have those that are in raised beds and very organized, or you can actually incorporate some of those edible plants into your landscape. So I see beans growing here, corn's being grown, that tall, it's adding different textures to that landscape. So you can apply that knowledge in crop production to planting and maintaining an integrated multifunctional landscape system, okay? Incorporating edibles into your landscape can increase diversity and complex plant systems, increase that diversity. It can minimize those monocultures and creates habitat for beneficial organisms. And in some cases, especially when we're talking about different vegetable crops, unfortunately, we may actually be calling in more insects and pests than we want. But those plant species and varieties for yield and aesthetics, you can do both. You can have those that add color and beauty to your landscape. And in the end, you can actually harvest those and eat those. Now, when we're talking about edible plants, we must consider pollination requirements, and we'll discuss that further. When we incorporate edible plants into the landscape, we definitely have to consider the sun and shade effects. Crops typically need full sun to be very productive. They can create attractive shade in certain areas. The amount of sun, of course, affects the performance and the yield. If you are not dead set on the amount or the yield that you're producing and you just want to incorporate edible plants, you may not need to worry as much about the sun, right? The amount of sun that your yard is getting. We're going to need at least a minimum of 6 hours of sun per day to be a very productive, yielding fruit or vegetable. And we need to plan for seasonal variation in that sun and the shade and sun angle. Now, of course, with any type of plant that we incorporate into our landscape, we must discuss soil management. There may be some limitations compared to traditional gardens. Raised beds are very effective, especially when we're talking about vegetable production, and mulches are very useful anywhere that we're working in the landscape, and we'll talk more about mulches. The inputs required when it comes to edible landscapes, there is an increase in time and labor because we need to discuss, again, maintenance, fertilization, and then of course we got to consider the harvesting that comes at the end. And I know that I've been very guilty of being lazy and not harvesting plants when I should. So it takes attention, training, and maintenance, especially when we're talking about things that need to be pruned and trained, or those that may need trellising. So it does require a little bit more time and labor, but hey, that's so good for our health and well-being, right? Fertilizer, the frequency is often increased when we're talking about more productive plants that we utilize for edible consumption. Nitrogen requirements are often a lot higher. We'll talk a little bit about natural versus synthetic fertilizers, and then water, of course. The amount oftentimes in productive plants, those that produce will require more watering. And there are different variations in application methods, and we'll talk about that. Planting and replanting annual crops among perennials, when we're talking about that in the landscape, can definitely increase the diversity. There is more prep that may be necessary for the soil for annual crops. Woody roots can actually interfere, so that may be some of the prep and the maintenance that we talk about. And then it can disturb perennial root systems, but with proper planning, you can have those interplanting of annuals that we're going to rotate out in warm and cool seasons throughout the year. You can maintain that ornamental function of your landscape. The ornamental value of some food crops does wane. You do have to remove crop debris, and you must harvest those ripe fruit and mature produce, right? If we don't want them to create a mess. So sometimes you have wildlife that'll help you out with that. But when we are talking about edible plants, that harvest is also an important part of your maintenance. Green waste management, as I discussed, when we have the turnover of plants from season to season, you will often have a great deal of plant debris and green waste. The good thing about this is that we can compost it, right? And then we have nutrients that we can introduce back into the landscape when we plant annuals again. Of course, just as much as we love fruits and vegetables, our pests love them as well, and their management may often be more demanding with edible plants. IPM is more complex. We're going to talk more about integrated plant pest management and weed management without herbicides, because we want to reduce the amount of chemicals, especially when we're talking about edible plants. All right, let's talk about site preparation and the maintenance of soils when we're talking about including edibles into our landscape. So the soil functions, we all probably know that it provides physical support for our plants. It is where the water reservoir is, where our plants will take up water. It's also the nutrient reservoir where our plants will get their nutrition, as well as gas exchange. So our roots take up oxygen from the soil. The soil physical components, 50% of soil is made up of solids. That includes minerals and organic matter. 25% is made up of air, and the other 25% is made up of water. The soil structure is just the arrangement of those soil solids into aggregates, and the relative pore space is created. You probably all are knowledgeable in the fact that compacted soils can cause issues with plants. So including organic matter and compost can help with that. Good structure forms small granules readily, and a mix of large and small pores for that water and gas exchange. And that soil structure will definitely influence the aeration to the roots, so that gas exchange. drainage and root growth. When we have compacted soils, it can cause issues with root growth. In soil structure, organic matter can include plant debris and humus. It provides binding agents. It improves the structure of the soil, and that organic matter breaks down over time and can provide a small amount of nutrients to our plants in the landscape. The soil texture is just the percentage by weight of the three components, which are sand, silt, and clay. And again, that influences that water holding capacity, the water movement in the soil, the nutrient holding capacity, the tillage or friability and workability of that soil. Some of the major textural classes are sands, silts, loams, and clays. So you're all probably very familiar with the benefits of soil testing to determine the types of soil texture and the nutrients that are available in your soils. Here is just a nice picture when you're working with different soils that you can tell just visually. When we're working with soils that are more heavily clay, you see it looks like Play-Doh or something like that. When we have sand, it's a lot more granular and it's more friable and will fall apart more easily. We got to talk about pH when we talk about soil. That is the acidity or alkalinity of the soil solution. 7 is neutral. Lower than 7 is an acidic. Higher than 7 pH is alkaline. And our crops grow best between a range of 5.5 to 7.5. But of course, it is very species specific. And one thing to note is that nutrients that are available at different levels, as this schematic is showing here, at different pHs, some nutrients may not be available. Moving on to soil management considerations and edible landscaping. If we're going to incorporate annual crops, that will be routine replanting, the interplanting of those edible crops into existing landscape area. The fertilizer management for edibles versus ornamentals, again, with edibles that are productive and produce fruits and vegetables, typically require more nutrients. And we can also talk about if you don't have great soils, right? Vegetables and fruit trees lend themselves very well to being grown in containers, and containers can be part of the landscape. Remember that our outdoor areas, such as patios, things like that, are considered part of the landscape. So growing in containers can be a wonderful option, especially when we're talking about those types of plants that may be more susceptible to cold temperatures, such as citrus. I often grow my citrus in containers that are on wheels so that I can move them in when we get really hard freezes. So that can be a wonderful option. Routine replanting of annual crops. You want to dedicate bed space if it's possible. Amend before planting with organic matter, perlite, etc. if your soil may require it. It can be difficult to amend in areas after the landscape site is established. So keeping those annuals to the front of beds where they're more workable creates an ease of transplanting from cold season to warm season. So when we're thinking of how to incorporate these different edibles and annuals, we want to consider that when we're installing these. Interplanting edible crops into existing landscape areas can be difficult to interplant some seasonal crops routinely among established ornamentals. It can be difficult to dig, especially if we have large trees with huge root systems, shrubs that have a large root system, and it may make it more difficult to cultivate soil. So working in areas, dedicated areas, or having those towards the front of the beds that we can work them in will help reduce the amount of root disruption when we're changing out seasonal plants. And do the soil conditions meet those needs of seasonal or perennial edible plants being added? So we need to make sure that we know what types of soils we're working with and what types of amendments may need to be utilized. Again, container growing can be excellent way of dealing with this. If you have any issues with your landscape beds or soils, It avoids those soil management issues that we discussed. You can select quality potting medias, bark, forest products, core. With container plants, we always want to assure good drainage, right? And that will also increase the amount of fertilization that will occur, because as we water those plants, we want it to have good drainage. That also means that the nutrients are going to leach out more quickly, right? And it can also lead to accumulation of salts and things like that. We need to be leery of that when we're talking about growing in containers. But with the proper management practices, you can be very productive in containers. All right, let's talk about irrigation, composting, and mulch. So a traditional garden layout, when we think about a vegetable garden, looks very similar to this. We plant in rows. This is a beautiful diagram here on the right-hand side. But what we're talking about now is adding edible into your landscape layouts. And that can include adding to the existing beds. It can be creating raised beds for edible food production in your landscape. It can be container plants. So it can be a wide range of things. The scale can be very small or it can be large. It all depends on your space and the amount of time and effort you want to put into it. When we're thinking about how we're going to plant into the landscape, you want to consider your water use and you want to plant in hydrozones. So if you look at this diagram here, we're going to keep plants with a lower water demand contained to an area versus those that have a very high water demand, because we're going to water these differently. And we'll talk about different watering systems. Now with higher density, that's going to have a greater water requirement. To conserve water in your animal landscape, you can do that by hydrozoning, like I just mentioned, your low versus high water use areas, scheduling those irrigations based on plant needs, making sure your sprinklers and drip systems are working properly. So working with irrigation professionals to assure that you're using and not overusing the amount of water that's necessary. By utilizing mulch and soil amendments, we can improve that water conservation when we're talking about edible landscaping. So to conserve water, again, if we plant in hydrozones by placing plants with similar water needs together, and then we irrigate them accordingly, we can greatly conserve the amount of water that we utilize in the landscape. We want to use efficient systems. If you like to get out there and use the watering wand and the hose, it can be very therapeutic. I could water for days on end. Hand watering can be very efficient if you have the time to do it. Irrigation can save you on time, however. So utilizing systems that are drip, low flow, low volume, that can include mini sprinklers, tape, soaker hosers, etc., can also be very efficient. And we can work them on timers. And if we utilize them and water at the proper times of day, we can conserve water. So not going out there and watering in the heat of the day where we're going to have high evaporation rates, right? We're going to water later in the evening, early in the morning, let those roots absorb that water. And we can set timers when we're working with systems to assure that we are conserving water in that way. Drip irrigation for edibles can reduce soil evaporation if we apply that water directly into that root zone. So that can be very helpful talking about drip irrigation in water conservation. Now, there are different types of drip systems. You can have microtube emitters, as you see here. We can have a single drip emitter here. There are stakes that you can utilize. There are also the soaker hoses that can be very important. That low flow helps that water percolate down into the soil profile and helps that root zone to absorb it at that lower rate. You can conserve water by utilizing compost. So adding amendments to your soil, you can improve that water holding capacity and the drainage with that compost. If you mix it in evenly into the soil, into the top 6 inches up to 1 foot, can really help you conserve water and improve that water holding capacity. We can also conserve water by applying mulch around plants. When we're talking about working with vegetables, my preference is working with pine straw mulch. Often large nuggets can bind up nutrients. So utilizing pine straw mulch, it all depends on what your preference is. We also have mulch fabrics. There are straws, but we want to make sure that we get those that are not laden with weed seed that can cause problems later on. But applying mulch, we know, can help conserve water. It can help moderate the temperature of the soil. So in the wintertime, it can actually keep those roots warmer. And in the summertime, mulch can cool those roots off. So it can help moderate those temperatures as well as decrease the amount of weeds and conserve water. So other methods to conserve water in and around edible landscapes, we want to remove weeds that are competition for water. We want to irrigate established plants deeply and infrequently. We want to avoid watering every day, only when it's needed. Water a few inches below the current root system during each water to encourage that deep rooting so that they can get down to that water table. Avoid over fertilizing. We only want to fertilize when needed because it can create those flushes of weak growth and increase the amount of water that is required. So just being aware of that. Again, one great thing that we can do in our edible landscapes, in any landscape that is, soil amendments such as compost, again, improves that water and nutrient holding capacity. It improves drainage in heavy soils that have heavy clays and are compacted. That can really help break it up. Compost helps with that. It can prevent and reduce erosion. It improves that soil aeration. It may decrease that chemical fertilizer requirement and increase the number and range of microbes that are beneficial, right? We've learned more about that in the past few decades, those beneficial microbes that are in the soil. Compost is not really considered a fertilizer, but it does contain a small amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, mostly in organic forms. It is released slowly to the plants, not readily leached from the topsoil, and those micronutrients can also be found there that are essential to plant growth. To amend soil with compost, you want to amend the entire planting site or the bed when possible, adding at least 30% compost by volume to the original soil. Thoroughly mix that compost again in that 6. You can go up to 2 feet deep depending on the depth of the expected root zone. You can directly seed those. You can seed edibles directly into the garden soil amended with that compost, or transplant seedlings and container plants into the amended soil at the same depth they were in the containers. And then we're going to irrigate immediately and maintain a moist root zone through that establishment. More on the benefits of mulch. Again, it reduces water evaporation from the soil. It can help reduce the amount of erosion. It buffers that soil temperature. It reduces the weeds. And in some cases, it can help prevent mechanical weed whip or lawnmower damage to trunk trees. As long as we are not doing that mulch volcano. You can see here from this photo where it was mounded up on the trunk. And as we heard in the last talk, this can cause issues and lead to more pests and disease. So mulch should not be touching the trunk. Some trees develop girdling roots and or disease problems when that happens. We want to have more of a pitcher's mound when we're talking about mulching, but it can be so important in helping with water conservation, reducing weeds in the landscape. We want to apply about 2.5 to 4 inches of mulch on top of the soil. Carefully spread that compost around when we're talking about compost as a mulch, carefully spread that compost around the base of the plants using a shovel or rake. Avoid applications around the trunk of the trees, again, to prevent those pests and disease, and apply outward toward the drip line of the tree. One other type of mulch that can be very beneficial, there are actually biodegradable ones now, but landscape fabric can be very helpful in reducing the amount of evaporation of water and reducing the amount of weeds. You can utilize landscape fabric and then top it for aesthetic or for additional coverage with another mulch on top, whether it be pine straw, bark mulch, what have you. All right, let's talk about pest management in our edible landscape. Integrating pest management into your edible landscape. What integrated pest management techniques have been mentioned so far? Well, first of all, we want to choose well-adapted species, having those varieties that we know have less pest and disease incidents can really help in this area. We want to avoid over-fertilization and overwatering that can lead to pest problems. And of course, by controlling weeds, we can reduce the amount of herbicides, and by including mulches, we can help control those weeds as well. So this is kind of that integrated pest management technique where we're looking at every arena that we can in order to minimize the pests that are in the landscape. Sorry, y'all, every now and then my slides freeze. All right. Again, a little bit more on integrated pest management. It's the same IPM approaches for edibles and ornamentals. Expectations are important. We want to be able to correctly identify those pests, need to be vigilant. A good garden is one that is visited very often so that we can identify and scout for different pests. It's also important to identify beneficial insects and make sure that we have those in the landscape. We can have cultural and mechanical controls. We can have the use of biological controls. And then, of course, chemical controls as a last resort. And I won't go into too much detail there. But when we're talking about pesticides in edible landscapes, we need to pay attention to the label. We need to apply in the correct season, the minimum days to reapply. We need to look at the harvest intervals. If we are going to be consuming these edibles, right, we don't want to be spraying chemicals and then harvesting the next day. So be sure that you look at the labels for edible plants, incorporating more organic options such as Spinosad. So for example, we have Cucurbits here, including cucumbers, summer and winter squashes, pumpkins, edible gourds, and watermelons. This one looks specifically at leaf miners, thrips, and worms or caterpillars. The maximum number of applications per season is 6. The minimum days to wait before reapplying is 5. And then the minimum day to wait from last application to the time that you can harvest, all except cucumbers, is 3 days. Cucumbers is 1 day. So we need to be aware of how often that we can apply, how many applications we can make in a season, and when the last time we can apply before we're actually going to harvest and consume. All right. Let's talk about fertilizing. Fertilizer management for edibles versus ornamentals. Edibles often have a greater fertilizer need, especially nitrogen. Special nutrient needs for some crops to produce very well. So making sure that you're consulting for each different type of plant that you're growing for edible consumption, consulting the tables for fertilizers based on the size of the plant, the age of the plant. And I know that Extension has all of that information available for each different type of crop. Edibles often require more frequent fertilization. Side dressing with nitrogen on seasonal crops can be very beneficial in production. Annual fertilization of perennial crops, and consider using slow release nitrogen. All right, let's talk a little bit about fertilizers in the edible landscape, natural versus synthetic fertilizers. Natural fertilizers feed the microorganisms in the soil that break it down for the plants. The nutrient content may not be known for manures and other organics. Slow release, they're hard to damage plants. They're less damaging. Bulky uses more resources to ship, but derived from renewable resources, and you can even utilize waste products, again, such as compost. And unfortunately, these can often be more costly. Now, when we're talking about synthetic fertilizers, they can provide nutrients immediately available to the plants, but may not help the soil ecosystem per se. The precise nutrient content is known, so that is very beneficial. It can burn the plants with too much too fast, and it can also leach out quickly. So those can be some of the negatives of synthetic fertilizers. They are more compact, thus more efficient to ship, but they're made from non-renewable resources. One bonus is that they are usually less expensive. So whatever conventional versus organic you are comfortable with, feel free to go either way. Just know that there are pluses and minuses for both. Some of the animal-based natural fertilizers can be animal products such as blood meal that are very high in nitrogen. This can be great for side dressing. We've got bone meal, feather meal, fish products, animal waste products. They have the example of bat guano and manure and compost. But when we're talking about food safety, we'll talk about this a little bit here shortly. We need to make sure that we are applying these and not making ourselves sick, right, with something like salmonella when we're working with manures and things like that. Some other plant-based natural fertilizers can be alfalfa meal. You can see these have low nutrient content. This may not be the route that you want to go, but when we're working with more plant-based natural fertilizers, it's typically more environmentally friendly. So soybean, kelp, seaweed, these are just some other examples. All right, now let's talk about harvesting. Resources go into producing a crop. That allows harvest to suit the personal ripeness and preferences. Plan to be available for that process. Unless you just want to plant for the wildlife, I guarantee that birds and caterpillars and other things, other small mammals will enjoy your fruit if you don't want to harvest it. But be aware that by including edibles in your landscape, that will require that maintenance and the harvest as well. Some general rules of harvest. Each crop has optimal harvest periods and methods. You need to be aware of those harvest times. They don't all produce at the same time. When we're planning, you want to consider those different harvest seasons. The variations are based on individual taste preferences, your sociocultural orientation, physiological characteristics of the fruit, varietal differences, planned use of the crops. And we want to make sure that when we're harvesting during cool temperatures. If these are summer producers, then we're going to harvest in the early morning or in late evening. Stages of ripening, fully ripe trees or fully tree ripe. That full maturity and optimal stage is for harvest is when it's fully ripe, best for fresh eating and drying. Firm ripe is better for freezing or canning. And some important quality factors are the taste, the color, the firmness, the size, and hopefully minimal defects when we're talking about stages of ripening and harvest times. We also need to talk about sanitation when we talk about harvest. Use only clean, sanitized buckets and bins. You want to wash your hands prior to harvest. Wear clean cotton gloves to help reduce contaminants on your fruit. And do not stack your bins or buckets. Make sure that when you're cleaning that you're doing a 10% bleach solution to help sanitize those buckets and things like that. And just being aware that when we're harvesting, we're going to reduce those contaminants by rinsing with water, and sometimes vinegar solutions can help with that as well. Storage and preservation considerations. Sometimes we have more on our hands than we wish. That's great for sharing with your neighbors. Some large trees and vines can produce several hundreds of pounds of produce. Do you have time to process, can, dry, ferment, pickle, or freeze? Some people really love doing this. Others do not. Check. There's a hand raised. Do you want me to take questions now, or should I wait till the end of the presentation? I guess I'm going to wait if that's okay. Check your available freezer space. Make sure you have enough space. You can air dry herbs. Oven dry, sun dry, use dehydrators. My friend Sherry Dorn loves to dehydrate her apples, so that can be a great use. And consider term refrigerator space before your harvesting begins. Some key storage requirements depends on the product. Store in a refrigerator. Most fruits and vegetables and herbs can be stored in a refrigerator. Some things need to ripen on the counter, then refrigerate. Those are primarily your stone fruits and avocados. You can store at room temperature many tropicals, basil, and some vegetables, and most produce will store the longest if they're harvested in the cool morning hours and then placed in a refrigerator. Be aware of contaminants, right? Especially when we're talking about edibles. Common sources of foodborne pathogens, microorganisms that cause illnesses in produce include coming from the water, animals that may be around, including humans, soil amendments, especially those that are animal-based, compost. We want to make sure those manures are properly aged, right? When we're utilizing them, we want to prevent splash of that onto the plants or onto the fruits and the vegetables that are harvested, just to help minimize that contamination before we eat. All right. Make sure you know the history of the land. In a lot of areas, there are some heavy metals that can be, especially when we're talking about urban areas. So be aware of that. You want to do some risk assessment, be aware of pesticides, cattle, and poultry uses. Consider your neighbors, the zoning in the surrounding areas, lead paints. Lead can be very persistent in soil. So being aware of that, it can come, they're not utilized anymore, but in urban areas, it may be present in the soil. So be aware of that. And then we got to be aware of existing structures and equipment such as septic tanks, plumbing access, toilets, what have you. All right, when we're talking about including fruit trees in the landscape, we want to make sure that we allow enough room for it to grow, for us to prune, thin, and harvest. The roots will spread about 2 to 3 times the width of the canopy. So we want to make sure when we're placing it in the landscape that we're giving it enough room. Consider the effects of sprays on adjacent plants if we have to utilize any sprays. And consider clustering fruit trees and keeping them small. Similar irrigation, bird netting, mulching, pollination. We're going to keep those types of things all in the same area. And when we're choosing plants, we're going to think about that as well. Some low maintenance fruit species can be caneberries and blueberries, citrus. If we don't have extended freezing, figs can be good. Jujubes are a little different. You can incorporate some of those into the landscape. Persimmons, plums, possibly pomegranates. It may get a little bit too cold in certain areas of Georgia to include those. Apples are not on here. I don't know how, I must have deleted apples, but we've got apples as well. Peaches, right? So these are some of, now these specifically are low maintenance. Some problems with some fruit trees, apples and pears are susceptible to fire blight and codling moth. With citrus, the Asian citrus psyllid, which causes citrus greening, some scale insects. Of course, frost is a concern when we're talking about citrus. Peach and nectarines, peach leaf curl can be a problem, and grapes, powdery mildew can be an issue for. Aesthetics versus production, it depends on your interest. It should be a balance. In a landscape that's properly designed, you want a little bit of everything. Tall versus short. Short trees are easier and safer to manage. You can utilize genetic dwarf or dwarfing stocks when we're talking about citrus and other fruit plants. Tall trees are aesthetically pleasing and provide fruit for the wildlife. They also provide shade for our homes. The weight of the fruit may bend branches down and may break. Pests can be a little bit more difficult to manage on larger trees, and it makes spraying more difficult, and fruit drop may be a problem for you. Site selection, again, remember that we need 6 to 8 hours of full sun. We're going to shelter from high winds. Some trees may benefit from a warm south wall. Avoid planting where fruit falls on walks or driveways, and the soil should be at least 2 to 3 feet deep. Site selection issues when we're talking about trees, wind protection, full sun, and keeping that fruit from falling away onto walkways. And in many cases, especially when we're talking about blueberries and other small fruits, bird netting may be required if you want to get a share of your bountiful harvest. Some site selection issues, large trees and frost protection may be difficult as they grow. So if you have any type of citrus, that may be an issue if those get too large. One solution is putting those in containers. You can help to keep them more manageable in that way. All right, when we're planting fruit trees, just like anything else, we're going to check the roots, cut off dead or damaged roots, make sure that your whole side is wide and deep if it's compacted. You want to kind of plant on a mound to keep that crown dry. Plant high. That reduces that chance of crown and root rot. You want to make sure that the graft union, especially when we're talking about those types of fruit trees that are on dwarf rootstocks, that graft union is well above the soil, that the previous soil line is at or above the soil level, and allow for soil settling. So pull those roots out. You want to prevent any girdling. You can also cut the soil, the outer portion. It's fine to do that. Don't cover the soil in the pot and water in very well. And don't forget to mulch. All right, now let's move to what we can put in the landscape. Of course, citrus, the requirements are 8 hours of sun. Make sure that they have good drainage. They can be very nitrogen dependent and micronutrients. Make sure that they have enough space. And remember, they are not very tolerant of hard freezes. Covering will be an issue, and possibly growing in containers may be the best. Now, once they're established and grown, they can tolerate colder temperatures, but you want to ensure that you don't lose your plants, and that can often be an issue with citrus. Again, frost protection and tolerance. Certain varieties are more frost sensitive than others, and make sure that you're aware of what types of varieties you're working with and that they are more cold tolerant. You can utilize them as a specimen plant. The fragrance of citrus plants is just intoxicating. I love it. My lemons are in full bloom right now. Unfortunately, they're in the garage and I can't enjoy them as much, but not only do they produce fruit, but they have that wonderful scent. So that can add some of that beautiful aesthetic to your landscape. You can utilize citrus as a hedge or a border, and think about what you're going to do with all that fruit when you have it. Again, edible landscaping with citruses. Container citrus can make them more portable. Containers can be utilized as accents, and they can open up new areas in your landscape. Grapes and muscadines can also be utilized, especially for vertical growth. If you want to incorporate trellising into your landscape, they're adapted to a wide range of soils. They require about 6 to 8 hours a day of sun. You're going to need good irrigation, and drainage is very important. And of course, they're going to need support and regular pruning. Blueberries are an excellent, they actually have nice fall foliage change, especially when we're talking about native rabbiteyes. They're an excellent low maintenance crop that fit well into edible landscapes and provide fruit. Blueberries are self-pollinating, but the fruit production will improve if you have several varieties that are also planted into the landscape. And blueberries are some of the most nutrient dense, considered one of those superfruit foods that provide antioxidants and so many wonderful things, fiber, right? The birds love them, so you're probably going to have to fight them off with a stick or get you some bird netting. I'm kidding about the sticks. All right, blueberries in containers can be excellent. I've seen studies done in 20, 30 gallons, as you can see in this picture here. They're an excellent choice for containers with you have to have adequate watering, and of course, drainage is crucial. Your soil level will eventually go down due to high organic matter requirements for blueberries, but there are dwarf varieties that are available, so look for those. Blueberries will grow well in most soil types, provided the soil is porous and well drained, and they do like an acidic soil. They also have beautiful clusters of flowers that bring in the pollinators. So they're wonderful for ecosystem services when it comes to pollinators. And of course, harvesting depends on the types, whether it's Highbush or Rabbiteye. You can extend that harvest depending on the types that you install from May all the way to July into the summer. All right, we can talk also about blackberries and caneberries, boysenberries, maybe raspberries is pushing it. We were doing some research when I was at LSU on incorporating some raspberries. Those typically need trellising, right, and proper pruning, but they can be an excellent addition to the landscape. All blueberries do not have to grow on, or caneberries do not have to grow on trellising, but you end up with a mound like this that may be a nightmare for some people. To keep them from getting out of control, you're going to have to prune them and train them. All right, you can also use them to form a dense screen. So that can be an added benefit of utilizing these in your landscape. But edibles bring the best of both worlds. They can both be edible and ornamental. Look at all the beautiful color that you see in these photos here. Interplanting actually helps reduce pests. It introduces new textures, forms, and colors into your landscape. You can grow what you like best. It's fun for everyone. It's really cool when you can go outside and harvest your own rosemary, different types of herbs that you utilize in your cooking. Hey, you need a lemon. Yeah, we don't get them year round, but it's very nice to be able to go to your landscape and harvest. And it's a great conversation piece. Incorporating vegetables into your landscape, make a list of edibles you like and that grow well in your climate. Realize that some plants may not be compatible with certain areas or existing plants. You've got to identify those cultural needs of each species. You've got to know the amount of sun and shade, the soil pH, the water requirements, nutrient requirements. And just like hydrozoning, we want to plant those plants with the same watering, nutrient, soil pH requirements together. Make your life a whole lot easier. Be aware of their overall form, size, shape, color, the flowers, the fruit, and make sure you identify any pests and disease that are common to that type of fruit or vegetable before incorporating them. All right. Some plants have varieties or cultivars that are better suited for your landscape. Know their drought tolerance, salt tolerance. When you're looking at labeling and different cultivars, look for their disease resistance or improved disease resistance, improved pest resistance. Look for beautiful colors that you can incorporate. Peppers can be one of those great things. And we're going to go through now and just discuss some of those different plants very quickly. Oh, it's 5 o'clock. We've got to go. Make sure your vegetables can be used as ground covers, as annual low border bedding plants. They can be utilized again as visual screens. We can trellis vines. You can grow them in hanging baskets and containers, especially when we're talking about dwarf plants. Now, make sure it's very important to grow cool season crops in the cool season and warm season crops in the warm season. They can be directly seeded, transplanted, or self-seeding. Many of these will be volunteers that come up on their own. There are so many non-woody edible herbaceous borders. This is a list here. I'll be sure y'all get a list of all these different types that can be utilized in the landscape. Some animals are very attractive plants, such as artichokes, kales. There are ornamental kales and edible kales. Lettuce, mustard, broccoli, and cauliflower. Beets are highly colorful. Chard can be highly colorful. Peppers, beans, and peas. Eggplants and tomatoes. And we can eat all of these. Look at this artichoke. That flower is just gorgeous. And the texture of the leaves is wonderful. So this adds that texture to your landscape. We've got kales, different colors, different textures. So adding that visual aesthetic as well as that edible component to your landscape. We've got different types of lettuces. We've got variegated ones of different colors, right? Different textures, different sizes. These can be incorporated into your landscape. Different types of mustards. Look at all the different colors that we have, color options as far as broccoli and cauliflower go. Beets can be very colorful in the landscape, as well as their underground parts that are edible. So beautiful. Chards can be very beautiful and add a lot of color and texture to the landscape. Peppers, lots of ornamentals, those that are edible. These can add a great deal of color to your landscape and those nutrients that come with each different type of color, antioxidant value, things like that. But we can use edibles, incorporate them into our landscapes. We have those added benefits. It adds beauty, it provides food to us, and it can be used in so many different ways. Just flipping through some more pictures, beans, eggplant, tomatoes can be grown in hanging baskets. You can provide areas for trellising, all sorts of options for the landscape by including edibles. There are those that can be used as ground covers. This is a list, and I'm happy to share it with you. Chamomile is often used, and it's got that beautiful flower. You can make chamomile tea. Thyme can be used as a ground cover. There's just so many options of incorporating herbs, vegetables, and fruits into your landscape that are both beneficial for you, for wildlife, for the environment, right? Rosemary, There's edible flowers. Here's a list of edible flowers. Borage is another beautiful plant. Lavender can be very scent. It's a wonderful scent, very calming, and it's also a great cut flower, something to bring indoors or to make soaps and things with. Nasturtium, squash blossoms are beautiful. Johnny Jump-ups and violets are edible flowers that can be incorporated. Chives actually have beautiful flowers when we let them go into bloom. You can create mixed containers. You can put it in your front yard. So utilizing different edibles throughout your landscape can bring so much value and so much added aesthetic to our landscapes. Sorry for going over, you all.
No problem. Thank you so much, Heather. It was really wonderful talk. And a lot
Thank you.
will be covered. I can see that. So, for the sake of time, I will take one question. Okay. So, this question is about pomegranates. The pomegranates seem to have mixed results in Georgia. So, what are the don't do that prevent good growth?
You said, what don't you do for good?
Yeah.
Say that again.
What is something that we should not do to
With
prevent
pomegranates.
yes,
Well, they
pomegranates?
do not plant them in a place that is very low. Okay. You want to have good drainage. Those are native to more arid regions, right? So we want to have good drainage. I'll tell you one thing that really loves pomegranates is stink bugs, and they will get all over it. They have the piercing, sucking mouth parts, right, that penetrate the fruit. They may be hit or miss here. They were hit or miss in Louisiana, but there are some cultivars off the top of my head. I have to look up cultivar names, but there are some that can grow. And growing in containers could be a great option. That way, you can move them if you need to, if the temperatures get too cold, and you can ensure good drainage. You have a little bit more control when it comes to containers. However, they can be a little bit more labor intensive.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That basically concludes our webinar for today. And Richie, do you have any comments? Last comments?
I sure don't. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, folks. So just make sure you get your sign-in sheets to us. And that address again is gtbop@uga.edu. I saw a couple of messages in there about not necessarily being able to print it off where you are today. That's fine. If you're not able to get to a printer today, just make sure that you print it off when you get the opportunity, and make sure you remember to send that to us. If you need to mail it to us, again, that mailing address is at the top of the sign-in sheet. And I just wanted to say, I don't know if you're getting tired of hearing it yet, Heather, but we're really excited to have you here.
Oh, no, I don't ever get tired of hearing that.
Well,
and
good.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, everyone
right.
take care, and we'll see you in a couple of months.
All right.